top left, you can see Alex Sadowsky. You all know he's a concept chef at Twin Peaks and is about to join the board of ICCA and be on one of the new board of directors. We have Stacy Rich. Stacy's a principal at Cornerstone Government Affairs. Many of you know the company because we worked with them several times in the past as experts that have been on either our webinars or actually have been live at some of our events and speaking to us. So that's going to be very interesting to talk about her world and what's going on in Washington, D.C. and with our government at this time of change. And of course, Jack Lee, everybody knows, the haiku master at Datassental, and he's got some great information for us as well. So let's get started. Stacy, if you want to go to, I don't know if you're going to start with your slides or talk a little bit and then go to slides, but you're on and I'll spotlight you. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thanks everyone for having me this afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I'll just do a brief sort of intro of my professional background, and then I'll go ahead and start my slide deck. So I have been in government affairs, so lobbying, for about a year now. I left the Senate about a year ago after 17 years, and so started my career with then Majority Leader Tom Daschle from South Dakota, and then went over, he lost, and I stayed on the floor staff, so working around the Senate floor, where I had a real focus on sort of the process, procedure, strategy of the Senate under Leader Harry Reid. And then eventually went to work for Senator Patty Murray from Washington State. She is the number 3 Democrat in the Senate and assistant Democratic leader, so I was in her leadership office. And so as part of that, sort of coordinated across all of the Senate committees and each of the individual Democratic offices to make sure she, had her finger on the pulse of what was going on with the caucus. So I'm very much a generalist. I want to say that up front, not the labor policy expert, but I'm no, inch deep, mile wide, and know enough to be dangerous, as I told Kevin when we first spoke. So anyway, wanted to kind of give a brief overview of sort of the current landscape in DC, and I'll focus on both COVID relief items, which I know are certainly of interest to the industry, as well as some upcoming, labor policy highlights that now that Democrats are kind of running the show, you will at least hear more about. So let me start to share my screen. I apologize if I botch this. Hold on. Okay. Let's see. Can you all see that? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes.
Good? Okay, excellent. All right, so hold on. Now I need to make sure I can change the slide. Aha. Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with just kind of look back, year in review, measures that Congress has passed in response to the pandemic thus far. We'll run through this quickly because I don't think it's, certainly not breaking news to anyone. Congress acted more quickly and more rapidly in this initial sort of bills they passed in response to the pandemic than I, in 20 years, have ever seen them act on anything. And so sort of in rapid succession, funding for vaccine development, funding for workers who we knew were losing their jobs kind of immediately, stimulus packages because the economy was faltering. And, we could go on the list of all the various industry-specific concerns, direct payments for individuals. Congress was sort of grappling with like a whole array, a country and an economy in crisis. And so the packages that you saw crafted very quickly and in a very bipartisan way early on in the pandemic sort of reflected the seriousness of the moment. And that sort of continued on through the spring with some tweaks here and there, where as we learned more about what the both economic and then, social impacts for families and workers would be. There was a couple of measures passed in response to those. So you can just kind of see all of those laid out in this chart here. Starting in the early summer, the House wanted to pass another very large stimulus bill and started work on that. And negotiations sort of were stop and start for a long time. They dragged on through the summer, through the fall. And I think at various points, all of us whose job it is to kind of pontificate and predict what Congress is going to do, we thought they were on the verge of a breakthrough. We looked at all the political dynamics. We thought surely President Trump would want to sort of strong arm his Republican allies in Congress into getting a deal because that could help the economy, which in turn could help his political sort of viability. And so in any case, it dragged on much longer than any of us anticipated and sort of culminated in that very large December package that we saw passed just before the holidays in December. This included $900 billion in stimulus. And I want to just, as we were talking about this earlier, something came up that I thought was funny. You know, as this bill was coming together, you could like search on Twitter and see, well, why are they taking care of some women's group in Ethiopia and not restaurants, for example? Or why is this in here? Why is that? And, you know, one of the sort of quirky things about Congress is when they have a moving vehicle that is a piece of legislation that is kind of must pass and they know is eventually going to make it to the president's desk, especially at year's end, it can become what we call a Christmas tree. So lots of things can ride along. In this case, many things rode along, including $900 billion in COVID relief, which, you know, that's sort of the culmination of all those months of negotiation, along with the annual appropriations bills. So the funding for our entire government. Some of the crazy things you saw on the news or on Twitter stemmed from the fact that this is like stuff our government funds each and every year. There's all sorts of crazy programs that you might not hear about otherwise. In addition to a bunch of other policies that folks were interested in moving before the end of the administration, a tax package, an energy package, what have you. I pulled just a couple of relevant policies that were included in the package for the restaurant industry. So we know there was a second draw, $284 billion for PPP, which allowed for additional first loans as well as second draw loans. And this was important for the restaurant industry because they had been advocating, you all had been advocating for a number of changes. And so some enhancements were made that I am told were quite critical, actually. In terms of size, restaurants got a special carve out to allow for loans that amount to up to 3.5 times the amount of monthly payroll versus 2.5, which is the other permitted loans. So restaurants had that sort of special increased enhancement. And then in terms of eligibility, there had been a really problematic provision where the intent had been to not pour money into like massive corporations who might not need the aid, but they had said that 300 employees for a company, which of course, if you're a chain restaurant and you have employees all over the country, you're well over 300. I don't need to tell any of you that. And so the restaurants advocated and secured an amendment that would make it 300 employees per location. So that hopefully was of great benefit. And then some other tax provisions were included in the deal around deductibility, the employee retention credit, the work opportunity tax credit, and business meals, which was the one that got kind of a lot of heat actually, because I think there was this notion of why are we taking care of like fancy, you know, Wall Street business lunches and not some of the other priorities. But we know that it was to behoove the restaurants. So that was the December package. Fast forward. And I think, you know, the weeks following that got even more exciting. The Georgia runoffs, of course, came. And I think even the most, you know, accurate of political forecasters really had some significant doubt that Democrats would pick up both Georgia Senate seats and thereby gain a majority. But lo and behold, it happened. And so we've had this massive sort of power shift in Washington, which is just creating some really interesting dynamics and is going to allow the Biden administration to potentially be able to push forward with a lot more of their legislative priorities than they would have been able to if Republicans and Leader McConnell held the Senate. So I'll hit briefly on sort of the impacts of this 50-50 Senate. As you know, 50-50 sort of means, well, who's in charge? Given that Vice President Harris is president of the Senate and has therefore the tie-breaking vote, that gives Democrats the majority. Chuck Schumer is now majority leader. So this has only happened 3 times in our history, the most recent being after the 2000 elections. And in 2001, then leaders Daschle and Lott had to work out a power sharing agreement where they said, okay, this is basically the first time in modern history this has happened. We're in a really political time. They had just gone through not dissimilar impeachment of Clinton. There was a number of things stirring. And so how are we going to work this out? And they both sort of felt like if it's 50-50, we want equal representation. So they worked out a deal where all of the committees, and so the committees are, who actually writes the laws, puts together the policies, are the experts on all the issues that we then, make laws about. The committees had equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats on each panel. They then had to set up a special procedure because, of course, you can imagine, particularly in a politically, divided time, if you tried to move any bill, what happens if there's a deadlock vote and there's not a majority to do anything? You could easily just end up sort of stuck. And so they created some special procedures to allow the majority leader to still bring bills to the floor, discharge bills and nominations from committee by putting it up before a vote before the full Senate. And so sort of starting a couple weeks ago, post-Georgia, Leader Schumer made clear he wanted to see something that sort of adhered to precedent. So that looked very similar to that 2001 power sharing agreement. Leader McConnell, however, decided to try and use his leverage of Schumer needing Republican votes in order to pass this Senate organizing resolution. And just for a little color, this is something that you would never normally hear about this. It would not be on the news. It would happen. It would come and go. You would have no idea. It became a big deal because McConnell wanted to try and secure some assurances, whether through a gentleman's agreement, like understanding, or more formally in a resolution, that Democrats would not make any attempt in the next 2 years to reform or eliminate the legislative filibuster. And so not sure how familiar everyone is with legislative filibuster, but this is why the Senate gets often stuck. It's called the tea kettle because it's where legislation goes to cool down, cool off, maybe wait a while. Everything needs 60 votes ultimately to pass. And so McConnell is, forecasting he does not want Democrats to do away with that, be able to pass bills with a simple majority threshold. So anyway, he finally backed off of that after some assurances from some of the moderate Democrats earlier this week that they had no intention of, providing votes to overturn the filibuster. And so it looks like we're still waiting to get this final organizing resolution set, but that should happen in the next couple of days. And now Congress can be officially formed and off to the races. So what are we going to do next? Let's see. First and foremost, we need to stand up a government. So Biden, has introduced a slew of cabinet officials that he's nominated. I think we've done 4 so far. And so this is very typical. We always prioritize the national security nominees, of course. Given we're in a pandemic, I think you'll also see President Biden want to prioritize some of the other relevant agency heads. So Health and Human Services, education, what have you. I expect now that the Senate is getting organized, those folks will all get hearings before the Senate committees and then votes on the floor. The one I wanted to highlight for you all today is the nominee for Secretary of Labor. So Marty Walsh, he is the current mayor of Boston in his second term. He also served 17 years in the Massachusetts legislature. And he's like what's being called a real union guy. He was head of the Boston Building Trades, one of the most well-established known sort of union groups. And he'll be the first union member to serve as secretary in over 15 years. Joe Biden, who enjoys a very good relationship with labor, organized labor, has for his entire, sort of Senate tenure, repeatedly says this when he talks about Marty Walsh. And so now folks have started digging in. What's his reputation in Massachusetts? What's he like? And by all accounts, he is known really as a deal maker. While he may, of course, have some very staunch beliefs and positions about workers and worker rights, he is very affable and wants to sort of come to solutions. And so he's a deal maker. He's a reasonable guy, is what people say. His priorities will really, well, first and foremost, will reflect President Biden's priorities in terms of what's needed to get our economy back open, people back to work safely, look at what sort of workplace safety policies are going to be necessary there. And then he'll be interested, of course, in a bunch of sort of wage and hour policy work, worker classification, minimum wage, I'm sure. He'll also sort of oversee a bunch of the UI expansions or extensions that may come into place as part of an upcoming legislative package. And then just quickly, a couple other officials to know about. So Julie Su, who is currently the California Labor Secretary, is in line to be the number 2 at the department. She'll be Welsh's deputy. And then James Frederick, who is a former United Steelworkers safety official, is going to be the head of OSHA. There'll be a slew of other people who are very critical to the work. So some of whom are situated in the White House with Biden, some of whom are, assistant secretaries for policy, what have you. So we'll be keeping an eye on that because those officials, those senior voices in the administration really do have an outsized sort of say in direction, vision, and policy, how policy is shaped. Okay, so once Congress has gotten to work confirming the cabinet and standing up this government, we know the first big legislative push is going to be around this proposal that President Biden actually spoke about prior to the inauguration. He's called it the American Rescue Plan. This is the $1.9 trillion proposal that he outlined and has sent out sort of a 19-page document about that includes a host of things that he views as emergent needs. And so this is very much, I think there's sort of 2 buckets, the ongoing pandemic relief, and so the rescue, and then economic recovery. And so this is more towards this is what we still need right now as we're continuing to deal with this pandemic across the country. So money for a national vaccine program, further, development and distribution, expanded testing, because we know that's what's going to allow people to really get back out in the world, to schools, to work, what have you, and feel safe. Money for, and again, schools will be a big one because I think a lot of people felt like schools and keeping kids there for equity reasons, but also just so kids don't fall behind, should have been prioritized a long time ago. So you're going to see this administration really bring that to the forefront. As you've probably heard in the news, the proposal also includes another round of direct stimulus checks to individuals and families, $1,400 that will bring the total up to that $2,000 amount that President Trump, plenty of Democrats, and actually even plenty of Republicans said they supported late last year. A couple other policies to highlight: the extension of the eviction and foreclosure moratorium, extension and expansion of UI benefits up to $400 per week through September, and then some pretty significant increases that should hopefully help relieve some of the financial burden on families, so to the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, and then another pot of money for really financially strained small businesses. You'll notice I skipped over the minimum wage provision. We're going to dig into that in a few minutes because I know that one is of particular interest, but it was notable that this was in President Biden's sort of, and remember how I characterized this, the immediate needs sort of proposal. So we'll revisit that. Now I'm going to talk through how Congress is going to go about actually getting this done, because as we've discussed, last year was a bit of a challenge with some of these packages. Okay, so the way congressional Democrats and leadership are approaching this is sort of on a dual track. President Biden, his sort of to his core, and I was in the Senate and worked there while he was a senator, and I can attest to this. He is very much a work across the aisle guy. He had and has amazing relationships with plenty of Republicans because he's the type of person who just wants to go sit down, not focused on all the yelling and, oh, we don't agree on this. He really likes to just sit down, dig in, figure out how we can get the job done. And so he has really touted, as you saw on the campaign trail, his ability to work across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion and kind of return to some sense of like how things used to run in terms of regular order and legislating. And so he wants to pursue that path. To that end, there is a sort of ever expanding group of Republican and Democratic lawmakers who are talking, I think, almost every day about what is in the sort of space of the possible when we look at these policies that Biden has put forward. I think they are meeting with very senior officials at the White House. They're having daily discussions there. And I am almost certain that President Biden is probably personally engaging in some of this. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, some of this may be, in sort of a red line or hell no territory for Republicans. But what would you be open to? And so they're taking a very close look at that. That's sort of one track. The second track, and this comes from the fact that like largely for the last decade, there's just been a legislative stalemate. Democrats are skeptical, feel burned. I don't know, however you want to characterize it. They're going to have a CYA. I won't use that phrase, but so they're preparing for the bipartisan path. In case that's not successful, what can we do to ensure we can move these priorities quickly? And so to that end, they are starting the process of putting together a budget reconciliation package. And this is one of the very few tools the Senate majority has to move a measure, move legislation with a majority vote threshold. So they can do it, if needed, with just Democratic votes. We've seen over the past, couple of decades, very high profile examples of this. The Republican tax bill in 2017, the Obamacare ACA, of course, in 2009. There are some, big examples of how Senate majorities and majorities in Congress have used this. And of course, the recipe for it is when you run the show. You have to have the House, the Senate, and the White House in order to make the conditions for any of this work. I'm going to return to budget reconciliation in a minute in the context of minimum wage. But before we do that, wanted to talk through some labor policies that you may just start to hear more about as sort of Democrats take over, as the administration gets stood up and you hear more about some of the Biden priorities in this space. So minimum wage, we'll get to again, and this does include a gradual phase out of the tipped minimum wage. Labor Department rules and regs. This is a space to really keep your eye on. Just because I think to start out, when the officials are all in place, they're going to take a look at all the rules and regulations that the Trump administration had put in place. And there was, I noticed, I think it was in late December or early January, just before the administration was changing over, the Trump Department of Labor put together what's called a midnight rule, where they're doing it on purpose right before they're leaving office. They finalized a rule on tipped wages that I think a lot of folks in the labor community have a problem with. And so I would view that as one of the relevant rules that the Biden folks could look to sort of roll back as soon as possible. And there's a couple different ways to do that. Sometimes it's more complicated than others. Sometimes Congress can get involved with something called the Congressional Review Act, where they actually have a vote on rolling back a rule, but that's a more extreme tool. Point is, I think to be Secretary Walsh will, and his team will get in place, look at sort of all the things that sort of came to pass under the Trump administration, see where they may have problems and start to roll some of that back. And then they'll get to another phase of doing some more proactive work, sort of across the board, across the policy spectrum. One thing that's clear is, to the extent there may be sort of legislative paralysis, if there is, we hope there's not, but if there is, the Biden administration will be aggressive about seeing what they can do through executive action, just as President Trump did and presidents before him have done. Another sort of bucket of stuff to keep your eyes on from DC, from the DC perspective, is OSHA safety regulations. I assume most of you are probably way more familiar with the nitty gritty of this than I am, but I would just say, whether it's looking at what sort of stricter enforcement mechanisms might be necessary, or if there are additional safety measures or tweaks to safety measures that are necessary for sort of the whole of society. So yes, restaurants, but schools, any public places, what have you. I think they're going to, as they get stood up again, they're going to take a look at that, see what might be helpful, what they view as necessary. And then I just think more broadly, there's some longer held sort of democratic priorities in the labor policy bucket that for a long time have felt, and I say this as someone who, again, my boss was head of the labor committee for Senate Democrats. Labor policy is notoriously hard to make progress on in any way, shape, or form. President Obama, and this was in a time when we had the House, the Senate, his very first legislative accomplishment was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And I think a lot of folks in the labor community felt like that was setting a tone for a president who was going to come in and be their champion. There were really no other labor policy wins or victories for the Obama administration. The last or the most significant labor win or legislative accomplishment of the last decade was actually under Trump. In 2019, the defense bill carried a policy that I believe provided paid leave for federal employees. That was the most significant labor policy thing in a decade. So that tells you, I say this only to illustrate how difficult it is, even when Democrats run the show, to actually advance some of these policies. So when you hear things like paid sick days, paid family and medical leave, these are things that advocates and plenty of people have been pushing for decades, but are going to be an extremely heavy lift. That does not mean that you won't hear a lot about it. And that, I think every advocacy group in town is viewing this as their moment. And so you'll start to hear more about those policies and others. Okay, so now, and sorry if I'm going on too long, I promise I'm almost done. So I did want to dig in a little bit further on minimum wage because I know this is of particular interest. So in fact, just yesterday, the Raise the Wage Act, which is the minimum wage increase, was reintroduced for this Congress by, so the two relevant chairs in the House and Senate, Senator Patty Murray and House Chairman Bobby Scott, as well as Senator Bernie Sanders, Pramila Jayapal, and Stephanie Murphy in the House. This bill, and we can run through real quick, so you likely know it would raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 gradually through 5 steps by 2025. This is a bit more of an aggressive timetable than previous iterations of this legislation that I think had up to 8 steps. So just a longer time horizon by which to implement. The bill indexes future increases to median wage growth, and this is just a mechanism that would basically prevent what we've seen for the last 15 years, which is no increase whatsoever. It would say going forward, wages should keep up with median wage growth. The legislation does include the phase out of the tipped minimum wage. So whereas in previous Congresses, this had been at times a separate legislative proposal, this one incorporates that into the bill. And we can talk more about that later if of interest. It also has a couple provisions guaranteeing teen and youth workers with disabilities are paid at least the full federal minimum wage. In terms of support, just to give you a good sense, so I heard Senator Sanders say yesterday at the press conference that they held rolling out this legislation that in the Senate, they currently have 38 co-sponsors, which is a good, that's 2/3 of the caucus or so. And in the House, they're somewhere in the 180s in terms of co-sponsors. They'll formally file the bill tomorrow and we'll get a better sense of numbers there. This bill also passed the House in July of 2019. You see there by a vote of 231 to 199, which would indicate a significant amount of support in the Democratic caucus in the House. The one thing I want to flag there is, and this may go without saying, so I apologize if so, but the dynamic for the past number of years for Speaker Pelosi was she could pass these lofty, big, progressive, bold policies. And she knew they were going to sit over on the Senate's doorstep and that Leader McConnell would not touch them. And they didn't have a shot of being signed by President Trump. And so just to note that there's a little different dynamic when you are playing with live fire. At this moment, when the House passes a bill and it goes over to the Senate, guess what? The spotlight's now on Leader Schumer and whether he's going to take it up and how he's going to, ensure it has sufficient support to pass. And so just a really kind of tectonic shift in some of the dynamics here. I included this just to give a sense. This I pulled from the Education and Labor Committee's website. This sort of lays out exactly how the phase-in would work. And I assume you'll share these slides later, so if you want to see more, you can. But in case that's helpful. And this is my last slide, I promise, but I do want to dive into this because it's super interesting to me anyway. Okay, so prospects for passage. And I want to be clear, so this bill that they're formulating right now in the track of if Republicans don't work with us, we're going to act quickly on our own. And for context on that, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer in the House last night announced some changes to the House schedule because he wants to keep members here, and work is going to start next week on passing a budget resolution that starts the process for budget reconciliation. And so Democrats are fairly intent on, if at all humanly possible, getting this bill on the president's desk by March 14th when unemployment benefits and a host of other sort of emergency provisions expire. So they're working backwards from March 14th. And they've determined that in order to do that, they're going to start the process on this reconciliation measure next week. If, of course, something happens and the bipartisan group has some success and can get something together that can suffice for both sides, great. If not, I suspect you're going to start to hear a lot more about this package. And so the package will largely reflect the policies laid out in the Biden $1.9 trillion proposal that we talked about earlier. As I said initially, it is no mistake that the minimum wage increase was included in that. He could have trumpeted that policy and started to build momentum and build a runway for it in a number of other ways, but he put it in this proposal, which shows the degree to which he's prioritizing it, right? So it's a Biden administration priority. It's a long-held policy priority for a lot of senior Democrats, very influential Democrats on the Hill, again, who, knowing the history and difficulty and uphill battle it is to get labor policies in place, are looking for the moment to be ripe to get this done. That said, so we know that the proposal does not have 60 votes in the Senate. Unless Democrats are going to eliminate the legislative filibuster, which would be a whole other situation. If that happens, maybe we can have another one of these and we can talk through all the things that might come into play. But unless Democrats do that, which I do not envision happening anytime soon anyway, not in the near or medium term necessarily, they're going to go through budget reconciliation. And so the question is there an appetite to push this policy in a budget reconciliation measure, either this one that's upon us in the next month and a half or so, or, we all anticipate a second package forthcoming at some point later this year. They may start talking about it this spring. It could happen in the summer or even the fall, but at some point we do expect that Biden is going to put out a plan for the sort of the recovery aspect of the economic recovery from the pandemic. And so maybe they decide, if it's not in this first package, which I personally don't believe that it has the support yet to be, maybe they'll make a play to put it in the second package. Some things to note: a lot of members, and not just moderates, but there are members who will want to have a say into what this policy looks like. Bernie Sanders has a big, bully pulpit and he can get a lot of attention, but he's not the only one who has ideas and opinions. Ooh, sorry, my geriatric Pekingese is deciding to chime in here. Friedman, hey, stop it. Sorry about that. So there are members who will want this to go through some version of regular order, have committee hearings where they're able to offer amendments, discuss things they've heard from constituents, i.e., I hear from my constituents back home that the tipped wage is problematic and that servers will be impacted, that sort of thing. Uh-oh, did I just lose my, can you all hear me still?
I just went to all of us because we got to move on the agenda a little bit. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, anyway, this is all to say, I do think they're building up momentum for this policy, and so there'll be more to come. And to the extent budget reconciliation starts to worry people, there's some hurdles they would have to get through. It doesn't feel like it's quite ripe just yet, but keep an eye on that space, I guess I'd say. I'll leave it there. Sorry, I went over.
No, Stacy,
would you say it's likely that it passes?
But we have some questions too, but I want to go to Alex first and Jack to get that in. And if people can just hang out and wait for the questions, because there's some very good questions that have been asked. But I'd like to get to Alex because I think some of that will actually be answered by Alex's opinion on what's happening in his world and what's been going on within their, Twin Peaks chain. So, Alex, let's turn this over to you and talk a little bit about, some of the things that's going on, and talk about your labor, what you're doing to control labor costs, and what's happening in your overall picture of the company.
Absolutely, and thank you for geeking out with us, Stacy, because that's on every single one of ours mind, because we're trying to figure out how to attack that problem both directions, right? How do we reduce our own costs? How are we going to increase what our sales are? And then we have all the political unknown on top of it. So it's kind of I think Jack put it pretty good yesterday, where it's like, hey, we really wish we could all just kind of be left alone and play by all the same rules, but it just keeps changing every single day, and it kind of is what it is. So the biggest thing, really, I think hopefully the longest term change is the cost savings tied to that QR code, right? The in-person printed menu that everybody's gonna reminisce over from days past. There's a huge cost savings tied to that for every single restaurant, like millions of dollars cost savings a year just by going to a QR code system. Not to mention, it kind of opens up some really cool avenues for all of us. And some stuff that we're looking at is, variable pricing by restaurant, by day part. Maybe a burger cost more on a Friday night when we know everyone's going to be there than it will on a Monday. And now, because of QR codes, we can adjust that on the fly. So kind of that real-time pricing is kind of unheard of in the casual or fine dining sector. And now it's opening it up for us. So that's a super cool kind of strategic pricing and planning method that we're looking at to try and help on both sides. Everyone's kind of done the SKU reduction, recipe simplification thing. It was really driven during COVID because of distribution. Now we kind of switch gears, and it's okay, well, what's the second phase look like to reduce labor costs, getting ready for eventually this is going to happen one way or another, like wages will go up, whether it's just the minimum wage. Generally we have to pay people more because I can't hire enough staff as it is. We literally have to go out and just pay above the going rate to try and get employees right now. The tipped minimum wage is about 10 times the impact dollar-wise, would be my guess, for a restaurant compared to just going up on minimum wage. So that is a real big doozy, and kind of a shocking thing that we found out yesterday got tied in all together in one bill. Don't know how that's going to shake out, but that's what I'm super interested in talking about. All of us are kind of looking at how do we raise our PPA, or per person average, and where can that go to, right? So do we raise all of our prices by 5%? Do we raise all of our prices by 10%? Just to try and offset all of these increased costs that are coming at us, whether it's COVID related or just general time related. We've really looked at technology, and Jack has talked about that quite often. Whether it's the QR code, KDS, kitchen display systems to try and make you more efficient at the back of the house, tablets to try and make servers more efficient, different type of POS systems to try and get kind of that machine learning and make us more efficient on that front as well. It's definitely a benefit for us in the ICCA and GCIA that are larger companies, right? The mom and pop places can't get close to touching what we're capable of just on our capital expenditure. Like we can go out and find the technology, spend the time, and then launch it. The little pizza shop on the corner can't afford to do that. So they're going to be really negatively affected compared to the rest of us, I think. We're a little bit more flexible and can pivot a little bit better. I don't see the outdoor dining thing going away anytime soon. Not necessarily a bad thing by any means. I think they've been doing it in Europe for years and years and years, and all of us have talked about kind of that al fresco dining is pretty nice, actually. And everybody's getting really inventive when you see like what people have done, out in DC and New York. And I mean, it's pretty cool, actually. And I hope that we can continue to drive that kind of outdoor dining and gain extra seats and extra space for all these restaurants. To-go stuff, everybody's been doing that. We went from pretty much 0 to 5% of our sales, so a massive increase, but not kind of where we'd like to be at or what the industry's seeing. But I think it's really dependent just kind of on our concept, but we're still pushing ahead. We're doing different third-party stuff. We're launching kind of the ghost kitchen concepts. We have a couple other concepts that we're launching within our own four walls. But then it brings up kind of what are the costs of doing business in the third-party world, and when is the third-party company going to yank the rug out from underneath everybody and say, hey, you can't run 8 concepts out of one restaurant anymore. So right now, those digital pixels are worth a lot, and third parties are just giving it up for free. So take it while you can is my advice to everyone and all of our members. Let's see, what else did I have on my notes here?
Why did you talk a little bit about the opening of new restaurants, Alex? Because I thought it was interesting what you closed and what you opened and why.
So overall, long story short, we decided the right thing to do for a lot of our franchise owners. We waived royalty rights for any new restaurant that's opened during the COVID time to really try and help them save quite a bit of money, keep their businesses afloat, and if they want to, open up restaurants. So we've seen a really big push, actually. They're able to leverage some really good real estate deals from other places and other things closing. And on the flip side is we've had to close a couple because landlords didn't want to work with us. So, I mean, majority of people were really understanding and really wanted to work with us. And we're long-term partners with a lot of these guys. Some of them just didn't want to budge. And we just said, good luck. Our Vegas strip location is one of the biggest and kind of the most notorious of those closures. But I mean, it was a 3-story building. It was massive. And then the strip looked like it was a zombie movie. There was nobody there. So, I mean, at one point we flew into Vegas right when we shut it down. There'd be normally about, 2,000 airplanes probably in that airport. There was maybe 8. It was insane to fly into Vegas and see just even the airport as literally a ghost town. There wasn't anybody working in the international airport. So we've opened more than we have closed. We opened an international location in Mexico City, which was even more interesting. So you double down on all of the issues, right? Mike's showing a little slide here on Mexico. Truth be told, they took way more serious the COVID everything. Contact tracing, sanitizing, temperature taking by automated camera in and out of buildings. I mean, they had people standing everywhere that were strictly for sanitizing and monitoring of COVID. I don't know what happens if you showed up red on one of those cameras, but I'm sure they would have yanked you and you would have just disappeared. But we've now, I have another opening next week in Arizona, in Tempe, Arizona. We just opened up in Hollywood about 3 weeks ago, Hollywood, Florida. We have a few more coming to South Florida, a few more in Texas. I mean, probably before June, I'll be at 8 openings, maybe 10 during COVID. So, I mean, it seems to be kind of that, it's a good business opportunity for a lot of people just because of the real estate. As long as you can function correctly, following the rules, keep everybody kind of safe and socially distanced. I mean, we're at almost 100% of last year's sales at 50% capacity on average. When some of the states bumped up to about 75% capacity, we were up over 2019. So I don't know what it's going to look like, and I don't know how soon it's going to happen. But I mean, I really think our sort of restaurants aren't going anywhere anytime soon. I think I'm just really sad, and I see the impact is really going to negatively affect the smaller guy way more than any of us. And I think we're all kind of waiting to see what that shakes out to and looks like.
That's great, Alex. Really appreciate that. Let's go to Jack now, and then I'll come back with questions. But Jack, you've got some interesting things to talk to us about, especially with automation.
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Kevin. I can pick up a little bit from where Stacy and Alex left off. And Stacy, I would say your presentation was so incredibly clear and really made apparent what's going on. I don't know why I've never seen a news telecast that's anywhere near as clear as the story you just told. So thank you. That was really quite helpful. And I guess as far as the minimum wage thing goes, there are going to be some pretty significant impacts, right, if that comes to pass. And I don't want to make a value judgment on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but maybe just sort of think about what the ripple effects might be. You know, restaurants themselves are not like super high margin businesses. Even if you're a pretty, successful restaurant, you're not like insanely profitable with all sorts of money left over at the end of the day. And if your costs go up dramatically, let's say whether it's, the tip minimum wage or just minimum wage, what's going to actually happen? And it'd be one thing if all businesses were likely to respond the same way. But keep in mind that we live in a culture where consumers value affordably priced large portions of food. I mean, that just sort of is the reality of at least this country. And I think you're going to find that there's going to be certain types of places that are going to be able to better deal with that than others. I think Alex just alluded to this, but if you're a big chain, you're probably going to be more prepared or be better suited to figure out how to do things with your labor pool, maybe make some capital investments that reduce your labor costs and figure your way out of it. If you're a smaller mom and pop, and in particular, one of those places that's been hammered during the pandemic, I mean, if you look at what's happened with restaurant businesses, chains have done reasonably okay. Mom and pops have actually stayed open longer than chains have. Fewer of their units have closed, but their business has been totally torched, way worse than chains have. You're probably gonna have to find a way to cut staff at some point. And, I guess there's a few different things you could do if you're a restaurant. You could either say, hey, we're gonna take some of that human labor that we used to have, and I guess you could maybe go to animal labor or something. Maybe like a donkey comes by your table and has guacamole and you pick it off that. That would be pretty inexpensive. Or you do the other thing, which is you say, I'm going to invest in automation and robots in some way. So I'm going to spend maybe a couple of minutes just talking about what that sort of looks like, the world of automation and restaurants. I mean, so we see a lot of it already, whether it's in restaurants or in stores. The smoothie making robot at Walmart. You've seen this thing on cruise ships as well. I mean, this seemed like a novelty some time back, but now it's, more than that. It's becoming quite common. You're going to see robots that make all sorts of different types of things in different walks of life, with food being one of them. Sally, the salad robot, which I think we've talked about on this webinar before, you've probably seen it at industry events. That company, Chowbotics, got picked up by DoorDash, got bought by DoorDash a little over a month ago to make part of their offering now too. And I think probably as something as they do more thing with virtual kitchens and whatnot, robots and food are going to be more and more a thing. Or right, like the Misa Robotics, robot that's being installed in White Castle locations. It's pretty crazy, like what these things can actually do. And it's hard not to understand that, that probably used to be a person that was doing some of that work. Although it looks like the people there, the employees are really proud of the fries and the onion rings and other fried foods that it makes. So it's great. Look, it's great for the business. It's great for consumers. And people actually like this idea. People are pretty positive towards the idea of having robots prepare their food and automation being more involved in their food experiences. There's also things just like payment, right? Contactless payment. I mean, most of you probably use phone pay, Google Pay, Apple Pay these days. Many of you may have started using it for the first time as a result of the pandemic. NFC, near field communication technology, sort of like the thing that enables you to wave your phone and have it pay. It's been around for years, like 6, 7, 8 years. I forget exactly how long. In all that time, those 6, 7, 8 years, 1/3 of consumers pre-pandemic had used contactless payment. Just a couple months into the pandemic, that number grew from 32 to 48%. It grew dramatically in a very short period of time, and the number I'm sure is much higher now. And we don't really think of that necessarily as, maybe we're replacing, work that might have been done someone else. Maybe it's just a portion of the work they would have done. We just see it as an improvement in automation. And here, this is something that was accelerated by the pandemic. And one of the long legacies of COVID is going to be all the things that it accelerated, and automation is going to be a huge piece of it, right? There's other things too, whether it's ordering at a kiosk or more, ordering ahead on your app or via your phone. This used to seem like sort of strange behavior that you would order your fast food meal first on your phone and then pick it up in restaurant, but it's basically what most consumers do now. It's more common to do this than it is to phone an order ahead. And we don't really think that, hey, it used to be that if I were placing an order, I might be placing it with a human being. Now it's just being done through my device instead. And it's really interesting. We asked consumers a question like, hey, would you download an app if it allowed you to order from your favorite restaurant in some way, or made it easier to order from your favorite restaurant? I personally find it annoying and sort of a pain in the ass to have to download yet another app, install it, go through all that. But here, you can see consumers say, yeah, I'm happy to do this. 80% of Gen Zers and millennials said, yeah, I'm happy to download another app if it allowed me to order my favorite things from my favorite restaurants. The only generation that majority of which didn't say, yes, I'd love to do this, are boomers, right? And even they're almost close to 50%. And this is really amazing too, right? I think Alex mentioned AI and machine learning. We are so used to the way that AI interacts with our lives when we turn on Netflix, the recommendations it gives us, or the recommendations we get on YouTube or our Amazon shopping basket. It's all AI driven, right? It's amazing how much Google knows about each one of us as a human being, and the ads that it serves up to us. It's actually sort of spooky if you think about it. I think we could have like a 2-hour conversation just about all the crazy ways we're being tracked, and it's very, very freaky. Stacy, maybe you'll come back one day and talk to us about what the government's going to do about that. But maybe they're the ones actually tracking us. I don't know. So, but people even say, you know what? If you could have food suggestions or many suggestions made to you, like, hey, what do you want to have for dinner? Would you prefer a human to make that suggestion, or would you prefer an AI? Yes, boomers say, I want a human being to make that recommendation to me. But among Gen Zers, a majority say, I'd rather have the AI do it than a person. So we're moving quickly to a culture where the majority, if not a vast majority of people say, yeah, I'm cool with automation. Actually, I'm not just cool with it. I'm like preferring automation over humans and human contact in a lot of cases. And if you ask people why they love the notion of automation with food and restaurant experiences, it's because it saves time. It maybe helps lower the prices. Maybe it speeds things up for them. They love that, right? But there is one thing that they say they're not so crazy about, that they're concerned with. It's the notion that automation could be replacing human beings. And about almost half of consumers in the US say that's actually a big concern for me. And it's interesting, though, if you break this out generationally, it's a big concern primarily for boomers. By the time you get to Gen Z, that number drops to about 1/3. And that said, that's still even only among the times that consumers can actually make the connection between automation that they love and the fact that it could be displacing a human job. We don't really think about that, right? You place an order on an app, you're not really thinking like, oh yeah, that was a person in yesteryear. You don't even jump to that conclusion. But once it's visualized in front of someone, yeah, you have about half the country saying it's a big deal. But that number, that 46%, gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we move forward in each subsequent generation. This stuff made news, when I think it was first published. I think it was, McKinsey did a study on this. I think Oxford did a study on this, and other organizations. But, you know, up to 60% of business processes are subject to automation. And the number of jobs that could be fully automated away is shockingly high. Like a majority of jobs that are done today are thought that they could be automated away. You know, this is actually Andrew Yang's argument for why we need a UBI, for instance, is that one day there won't be that many jobs for people to do, and we need to start preparing for a different type of economy. We'll see if that comes to pass. But look, if you're a restaurant and all of a sudden you're hit with this much larger human cost, it really does make sense to start looking at automation instead. And who's going to be able to afford that automation? It's probably the bigger chains that can do that. The smaller mom and pops, they really won't know how to do that in a material way unless, I don't know, some really innovative company comes along that makes it really easy to get in inexpensively. So that is an interesting outcome of what happens if minimum wage goes up dramatically, is you might see a real acceleration of automation, which by itself is not a bad thing, right? Efficiency is good, but it means that the way that humans interact with food could be different because we're going to be doing more things on devices, and there's going to be more robot stuff happening back of house. There might be robots front of house, and that could be interesting. Or, you know, maybe we figured out how to train all the donkeys, and that's the answer instead. I guess I actually think it'd be cool if like a little monkey came to my table and brought me my food. I would love that. I would pay extra for that as a consumer. That'd be a high value experience. So if there's a super innovative chef watching this right now, and you want to train monkeys to serve food or make guacamole, I will be your first customer. I know we're a little bit over on time, but the last thing that Kevin thought would be interesting for us to cover is just what's happened with the LTO landscape. So I sort of looked in some of our data and went back to 2015. This shows among big chain restaurants, basically, how many LTOs or new menu items are introduced each month from January of 2015 up until today. And you can see that obviously we had a huge drop off as we entered the age of COVID. And by the time we got to like May, we were at an all-time low, basically. But since then, the numbers started going up, and it hasn't fully restored to where it used to be. But we have a lot of LTO and new menu activity now, which is great. We didn't stay at this low number. You will see that there was a drop off in December of the year, but that's just because it was December. We often see a drop in many December. So I would focus more on this sort of ending November number right here, where we're getting back to something that looks almost like, you know, a normal, but sort of on the lowish side of menu activity, of new menu introductions, but not nearly as crazy low as we saw in the middle of 2020. Frankly, this is very, very good. You know, what we were worried of is if we saw a repeat of what happened in 2009 coming out of the financial crisis, where many chains basically stopped menu innovation or really halted menu innovation in a material way. And as a result, the brands became a little bit tired. The menus became a little bit tired. I think a lot of those brands had a hard time recovering. And it looks over here like the industry is making a real earnest and honest effort to bring innovation back to the menu, which is more important than ever. The stats are pretty clear. Something like 58% of consumers say they're now tired of comfort food. 79% of consumers want something new. They're looking for restaurants to provide it. They've been eating like unbelievable gobs of the exact same comfort items at home for the last year, basically. They want to try new things, and they look to restaurants to be the places that bring those new things to them. And I'd say, you know, the good news is I looked through some of our data is, here's our scores data set, which shows, you know, basically every new thing that's launched at chains, and do consumers like it or not. We're starting to see some really interesting variety again, right? We're seeing a lot of new things launch on menus. There are certainly comfort items in there, but there's also some really interesting things too. And we're encouraged by this. So I would say, you know, do not take your foot off the gas. Keep bringing interesting things onto your menu. Consumers are starving for innovation right now. They've eaten the same exact things at home for a year. They're sick of it. They want something new and interesting. And you could do it in a way where you're still offering up a comfort item, but you're twisting it up with the different flavors from around the world, or something new and trendy. Maybe it's your special new twist on a pizza or a burger or a chicken sandwich or what have you. You're bringing in maybe some spices and flavors consumers aren't that familiar with. They want that right now because they've been eating the same old for almost a year. So we call that Fuse-biquity, which is to take a ubiquitous platform and infuse it with interesting ideas. And that's what we recommend that pretty much every restaurant do right now. Focus on platforms that consumers love and bring something interesting to those platforms.
That's great.
And train the donkeys too. We think that's a good idea too.
I think I'm going to invest in a donkey or monkey farm after this conversation.
There's a lot of land out there in Orlando, isn't there? Or in Central Florida? Maybe we can open a business together.
Yep. Yes, there is. So, well, thank you. Really appreciate that. What we're going to do now, there's a couple of questions I want to ask. One thing I want to say, though, Jack, in your comment about Sally, it's interesting because the founder of Sally was a speaker at our Napa Valley ICCA Summit a couple of years ago. And his take was really interesting on the future, to your point you said about the independent restaurants being able to buy into this automation and robotics, that he is hopeful that the many people that he's working with that are working on a lot of different robotics for restaurants will get it to a point where it will be affordable for independents to be able to get into this. But as your point is very well taken, it'll start in chains first because it's
it'll start in chains first. Well, the interesting thing is the reason why robots are becoming a lot cheaper are because of cell phones, because a lot of them use the same sensors that are developed for cell phones. And so those sensors used to be super expensive, but because of all the development for cell phones, for high quality cameras and whatnot, it makes the robots a hell of a lot cheaper too. But still, look, if you're a struggling independent restaurant right now, you probably don't have the money to invest in that. If you're a chain, you probably do.
Yep. So here's a question that came up from a few people, actually, and it's probably something everybody can comment on, but Stacy and Alex for sure. But there were a few people that said, after seeing the slide that you had, Stacy, is will the end of the tip credit finally end our tip culture? Or what, by phasing out or phasing in the minimum wage and away from tips, will tips go away? Will it be done in a different way? Is there going to be, so that's it's a great question. I don't know that we all have 100% answer of it today, but I'd love to hear your opinions.
I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, right? Every standout, like groundbreaking person trying to do it. Danny Meyer is the perfect example that we talked about yesterday. It failed. And he had to come out publicly and say, I screwed up. And he reversed it really quick because it was really detrimental to their own employees. It caused massive turnover. And I think Jack was the one that said it yesterday. Everywhere that I've been that doesn't have kind of that tip service, it just kind of sucks.
Yep.
It does.
I agree completely.
It does.
I lived in Miami for a number of years, and in South Beach and around, it was mandatory gratuity, automatic gratuity, and service was almost always terrible. I mean, with a few exceptions, of course, but it was pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've traveled to a couple of European countries where there's either no tip or tips included, and similar outcomes. I defer to the experts on the impacts in the restaurants on the ground with tip wage. I will just say, as with sort of any big social policy change, structural change, it's hard. And I think legislators, politicians all recognize that. They hear from all their constituents, all of you, the CEOs of large restaurants, what have you. They are very aware of that, and they want to. I think there's a reason it would be like a 7-year phase in. Like it would allow some time to make structural adjustments to hopefully make this a successful thing, a successful system. That's also part of the Department of Labor's function and role in all of this. That's why you have regulatory regimes and rule makings to sort of make tweaks to law as is necessary and to respond to some of the problems. And so, I don't think we should view it as this zero sum, gonna implode the industry. I hope we don't. And I certainly know many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle also don't want the robots taking over and, want to look at what does the workforce of the future look like? How do we evolve right along with technology while all of our lives become a little more convenient? How are we ensuring we keep up with worker training and provide jobs that are so needed. So I certainly don't claim to have all the answers on the tipped wage. I would say I do think at the root of it, and the reason there are some staunch supporters of elimination of it is because it does, there are disparities, significant disparities, and there are people who are basically who are working full-time, year-round, and living in poverty situations because, it's not enforceable, and so there's a real desire to change that. And the impact, by the way, we talked about how the Biden administration is going to focus on racial justice and equity issues. Like, the impact is clear on certain communities. And so, anyway.
Stacy, if you're a betting person, what are the odds that you think that we get to that $15 minimum wage?
If I were a betting person, well, I think it is meaningful and telling that Biden, like I said, he did not have to put it in this very first proposal. I think there are a few things, Schumer, as soon as he became majority leader, said he knows that the American people are looking for big and bold policies, and that there's a reason the election went the way it did, despite, President Trump's overwhelming popularity with a large segment of the population. I think that Democrats think, there are a limited few items that they know enjoy massive public support. Climate change is among them. Items like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and what have you. There are things that enjoy a lot of public support. I think the minimum wage is among those. And so, it might take some time. Let's see how that's why it's so interesting to watch the dynamic in this initial testing of the waters with how both the bipartisan paths and then the Democrats go to lone path go. Like when you're watching the news over the coming months, pay attention to how the two sides are sort of struggling there. And it's made all the more interesting post January 6th, I think. A lot of people thought that may push some Republicans to want to work in a more bipartisan fashion. So let's see where we're at post impeachment trial and when this bill actually gets moving, when it's signed into law. And I think that'll be kind of telling. But I view this as a step in building momentum for an increase in the minimum wage.
You said it passed the House in 2019, right?
Yeah.
Was it strictly party line pretty much? The numbers would suggest that it was.
I think so. I'd have to go back and look at the tally. There are moderates on both sides that will often cross the aisle. And, there's Republicans in very blue districts who love taking those votes because then that lets them go back and talk to Democrats in their district and say, look at what I did. So there may have been some Republicans that crossed over, but largely party line.
And it has to repass the House this time again.
Oh, yes.
Stacey, I would probably say that you would suggest to us, and I think all of us individually and probably our corporations as well, probably don't do enough to get our voices heard when issues are very near and dear to an industry like ours. And I would suggest that we all need to do something to be able, because again, it's difficult for a legislator to really understand the nuances of our industry. And I think that's our role in democracy to have our voice heard and let them understand how this would impact the industry as a whole. And I know that there's some groups in the independent restaurant scene that are doing that. We're not a political organization by any means. And I know a lot of our members do actually have political arms to do that. But that would be my suggestion, is for us to, make sure that, if you know a legislator, have a sit down with them and let them understand what impact it would actually have on our industry.
Absolutely. So I think both providing that understanding and that lived experience of what you see as you manage restaurants, absolutely valuable. I would also, in addition to sort of raising concerns, I would get in touch with members of Congress that represent you or otherwise through associations, what have you, and also talk about some of the proactive steps you as an industry, as a single, unit restaurant may be taking to ensure that employee wages are not stagnant, that your employees are not living in poverty wages. Now, that may not apply. You all, I won't blanket everyone. There's plenty of good actors, of course. We know, though, that the reason it's a problem and a thing is because it's industry-wide, there's still plenty of workers that are well below. So, what is the industry doing to address that? Are there steps being taken absent, government regulations and what have you, to address some of those inequities or problems.
What's interesting is I would say that in a general rule, most of the chain restaurants out there aren't paying anybody minimum wage because you're not going to get the quality of employee that you want. And so
we can't even find bodies, let alone quality, right? Like we want somebody with a pulse to show up at the back, like at the door every morning, and we can't find them.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting world we're in right now, especially with all the relief packages out there. And when people can make more money to stay at home than they can to come out and actually get in the restaurant, workforce. So those are all things that we'll see as this year goes on and what happens with that. But I want to thank all of you. It was awesome. I think the information was great. Sorry, everybody, that we ran over a little bit here, but I really appreciate. Thanks to all the members and sponsors who were, with us this entire time as well. We appreciate that. And Mike's going to show us a closing video. And again, I just want to, thanks for all this great information and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks when we do our next webinar.